Hello, this is Tamara from Fashion Roundtable. We're really excited to be bringing this partnership with SHOWstudio, front row to front bench, where we'll be taking over their social media and addressing a lot of the policy issues that we work on at Fashion Roundtable. Our comms and strategy director, Jodi Hamilton, is with us today, along with Heather Lafferty, our policy researcher. Thank you.
So we're just going to start off today. So I'm Jodi Hamilton, as Tamara said, and we're going to start to understand why Fashion Roundtable came into existence, and then we're going to move on to some key policy agendas that we're looking at the moment and why that affects the fashion industry in general. And we'll discuss that a bit more in depth with Heather. So Tamara, there was a specific moment at which you decided that Fashion Roundtable need to come into existence. Can you describe where you were at that time and what that felt like?
Thanks, Jodi. So I launched Fashion Roundtable just over 3 years and a week ago. And the reason that I launched was I had a great career in the fashion industry. I worked as a stylist and fashion editor. And then I reached a point where it wasn't feeding my soul in the way that it had been. And also, I think that anybody that's been in the fashion industry, especially at the level I worked at, knows that it's a really, really ruthless sector. And I was asking myself a lot of questions around politics, and I'd always been politically motivated and engaged, but I wasn't politically active. So I was approached to join a mentoring scheme, which I applied to. And that mentoring scheme is called the Fabian Women's Network Mentoring Scheme, which is not a very roll off the tongue name. We actually call it FWN because it's just too many words. Well, it's within the Fabian Women's Network, and they are essentially a policy organisation within the Labour Party. So I applied, and I was the first person from the fashion industry to apply, had complete imposter syndrome. There were people who are counsellors, human rights lawyers, the night czar for City Hall was in my cohort, Amy LeMay, lots of different amazing women. And it was the first time I'd actually been inside the Houses of Parliament. So my dad was a hairdresser and was the hairdresser for our local MP. So I knew about politics when I was growing up. I joined CND at 13 because I didn't understand why we had nuclear weapons as a young teenager. And I was always politically active, but it didn't really relate back to my work, other than I had a no-fur policy, and I would be very much aware of how I wanted the models that I work with to be treated, and the work that I engage with. But it didn't really run further into policy agendas. So out of the blue, my mentor, who is an MP in Westminster, Sharon Hodgson, asked me if I would like to join her team 4 days a week. So I was still doing styling, but I wasn't really like focusing on styling in the way that you have to if you're going to have the career that I'd had before. But I realized it was an opportunity for me to really understand what I'd learned in the mentoring scheme and then really grow that. And I didn't go in thinking, right, I'm going to launch Fashion Roundtable, this is my destiny, because I didn't think that. I was basically seeing whether I wanted to consider standing as a parliamentary representative, as an MP, or work and definitely by working in what they call the Westminster Village, you get a real insight on what that looks like and how that works. And I really was very different to everybody in there. And I didn't go in at the top level. I went in as a researcher, and it is a very different kind of organisation. You're working for an MP. It's essentially like working for a small business. Every MP is essentially a small business. So they've got a team in their constituency and then in their Westminster offices. And then you're working in whichever political party you're working on. I was really interested in Brexit policy because I was a real Remainer. And so I would go to all the Westminster events around Brexit. And Tim Shipman from the Sunday Times, who's a political editor, was interviewing Hilary Benn, who is the chair of the Brexit Select Committee. And I went in actually, so it was on my own time. I went in before my office hours to this meeting, a massive room in Portcullis House, where I've also hosted events when I worked for Sharon. And I was sat at the front row because I had learned if you go to the front row, you're really noticed. Obviously, fashion works on that level anyway. And there's a picture of me that they took, which I will share while on this takeover. And I'm literally writing in my phone because I'm realizing that I'm in a room full of men of a certain type, and they are really vocal about lobbying or pushing their point, because it's an access opportunity for them to speak to the chair of the select committee, which is the committee which is holding the Brexit negotiations to account and raising issues. And Hilary Benn is an incredibly clever man. I took the courage to ask a question. I remember I was the only woman that asked a question. And he guessed by looking at me and how I was dressed that I was in the creative industries. And then after, I went up to him and I said, hi, Hilary, I actually work here, and I wonder if I could bring some of my sector in to meet you, because I'm really concerned that they haven't been heard and their issues aren't being addressed. And he kindly said yes. And in under a week, I think it was, I brought together some voices from the sector, including Nick and Charlotte Knight from SHOWstudio. I had Net-a-Porter, I had the British Fashion Council, I had UKFT, I had a lot of different organisations, and also some SMEs, such as someone who's got a shop in Primrose Hill. So I had all levels of the sector. I also had the head of a modelling agency, so that they could really hear from diverse voices. And as well as Hilary, we had Matt Hancock, who is now obviously Secretary of State for Health, but at the time was the Minister for Culture. He went on to be Secretary of State for Culture. We also had his shadow counterpart, and we had Baroness Lola Young, who we now work with, who has been a key advocate on modern slavery and the amendment to Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. And she is co-chair of the Ethics and Sustainability in Fashion, APPG, that we work on, as well as people who were working on Brexit strategy and business strategy from across all the parties. And it was quite an achievement, really. And that was on my own time that I did that, because that wasn't through Sharon's work. It was what she allowed me to do. And it was really apparent through that conversation and through the conversations that came after it. I then partnered on an event with Matt Hancock and the BFC to bring stakeholders together, that this was a much needed conversation. And so when I left, my contract was up and I left, rather than thinking, do I want to be the next candidate for the Labour Party, which at the time also I didn't really sit with as comfortably as perhaps I do now on my personal political perspective. I chose to try to set up Fashion Roundtable, and I took advice from people I'd worked with, both in Parliament and out of Parliament. And I brought together stakeholders and Whitehall. So the first event we did, you came to, that's how I first met you. And we brought together civil servants from, like, the head of fashion from DCMS, which is the department that deals with the designer component of the fashion industry, as well as think tanks, as well as stakeholders. And I did this consistently and again, and it just roller coasted. And there were 3 pillars to what we were doing within Fashion Roundtable, which is education, sustainability, and representation and inclusion. And those 3 pillars have really held fast to all our work. And then very early on, I heard that the all-party parliamentary group for textiles and fashion was being recalibrated and rebooted, because that had been dormant all the whole time I'd been in the in Parliament. And I basically lobbied to be what's called the secretariat for the APPG. And at the time I had no budget. It was literally me, you, when you came in, Sam, who now is a civil servant and working in the civil service. And I brought together a cohort of experts to shine a light on different areas. So we, for the first time, not only had fashion experts, but also policy and economics experts. And that for me was really important because I wanted it to be a cross-section, not only of people from the fashion industry who don't necessarily understand how politics works, who've never worked there, who understand their own world and their own business needs, but aren't necessarily intersecting with those of the policy leaders and the policy makers, such as our parliamentarians and our government. And that, for me, was crucial if we were going to be able to translate our needs into language and into policy recommendations that they could understand. So I work very heavily on the policy side because I see that that's where change will happen. And I think that that is crucial for us to be as valued by policy leaders and by parliamentarians as other sectors which I never forget make less money and employ less people than the fashion industry. So we're here to celebrate the fashion industry, but also to promote it, and also to then advise on best business practice.
Can you, just for people who kind of don't know the difference between policy and politics, just sort of break that down and why it's actually important for us to engage with policy and what that means longer term, and the mechanics behind how we can do that?
So I think the thing about Britain actually that is amazing is that we have a civil service, and the civil service by their very nature have to be non-partisan and apolitical. So of course they've got opinions about policies, but they will do their best to be to A, follow the political agenda of whoever is in government, but B, also give them the most honest appraisal of those recommendations. So, you know, a lot, it's data driven. It's also insights from stakeholders, which is what we are essentially when we represent the fashion industry back to policy people, policy leaders. And I think that that is an asset that this country has, to allow for erudite, non-partisan information that goes back. So obviously everybody who's in politics has a political agenda. They have their own, not axe to grind, but they have their own decisions that they have to form based on ideology or belief systems. So, for instance, for me, the NHS is a tenant. A decent state education with STEAM, which is the arts as part of it, is a tenant. And then from those, I personally still don't think that the Brexit decision was the right one for this country. But within Fashion Roundtable, we don't follow my agenda. We follow the data and we follow the evidence. So we throw this back as when we did a survey, 96% of our survey told us that they were Remainers and that decision hasn't changed for them. And that's based on business rather than ideology. So it's not that they're necessarily completely married to the idea of the EU, but they can see the business reasons of why they feel like that. So it becomes much more, I guess, calm and less emotional. I mean, there's lots of emotion around a lot of these conversations, but we try to dial back from the emotion so that we can give evidence, because the thing that I've seen with the sector is that we didn't have the data. So I drill a lot into the data that comes from the previous policy agendas that have been around the fashion industry, but quite often fashion's been the add-on rather than central to the data. And the Office of National Statistics that we go back to a lot again and again doesn't have good data for the sector, which is why I think our work is so important, because if they don't have the data, how can you make policies that will support the sector? It comes back to the basics. So while there's lots of data going into the sector, such as the work you do around tech and the reasons why you need to do this kind of engagement, or people knowing how to use Instagram, for instance, for the right kind of pickup, they don't necessarily understand that if you're not giving data back to the policy leaders, you're not going to get the business opportunities that other sectors are. And I think that is really important for us to understand. So policy for me is about being able to give a holistic view and evidence without it being slanted necessarily. Obviously, we all know that you can ask a question that can lead to the answer that you might like to get. But before us, I don't think there were enough questions and answers being asked of our sector to represent us. And that is a massive gap. And I wasn't aware of that, I have to say, when I went into Parliament, because I'd been so in the fashion industry that I thought, of course, it was the centre of everybody's life because it had been the centre of mine. So it was a wake-up call, really. And that's why I tried to fill that gap.
I think, you know, the fashion industry is so diverse as well. So it has so many different types of people working in it, but also so many different types of roles. And, you know, we kind of tend to just go off and do what we need to do. And we don't really vocalize what we need from government, business, you know, tax breaks, all these different things. So we kind of just get on with it ourselves. And I think although we're very at the forefront of visual creativity and at the forefront of leading a dialogue around certain things, we don't push back hard enough. So I think, you know, Fashion Roundtable can kind of help that to happen and help those links to kind of come together. What do you feel from, you know, the decisive moment to now, 3 years on, what's changed? And, you know, obviously we've had COVID and people's minds are in a different place potentially around their work life and also the climate and all these things that are happening. Like when you and I used to talk 3 years ago, sustainability wasn't on the forefront of business minds. Do you know what I mean? It definitely is now, and it's got to be a pillar within every single business. So yeah, what's changed in 3 years, or what are the key things that you've noticed?
I mean, when you're a stylist, you have a sense of what's coming if you're good at your job. And I think that asset has helped me with this, that I can feel what needs to be a part of a conversation, and sometimes ahead of the curve, not to sound arrogant, but it's true. And I think that the conversations that we've had are now parts of every conversation in every business. I'm quite sure within the next 5 years, every business with a certain amount of turnover will have a diversity and inclusion lead. And you see that more in America than you do here. And I'm quite sure from the policy work that we're doing around representation and inclusion with Royce and Davina leading on that, we will see that happening. That will be an outcome. I think that it's normalized these levels of conversation. And I think for the sector, it's allowed people a place to get information that they weren't getting before, and a place for them to feel that they can have an overview and insight, because we're not partial. We're not a news organization with a political agenda. So the agenda is not being non-partisan and apolitical. That's our agenda. And then to respect and reflect back. So I think that's where our strength is. When I was on the mentoring scheme and I suddenly had this like amazing opportunity to meet these people that I hadn't met before. I hadn't been in a room with people like that before, really since university. But at university, you're 18, suddenly as an adult woman. It was really exciting. And I did have people in the sector at the time going, God, you're going on about this. And now they're not saying that. Now they're like probably really worried about their business. And they've realized that, we are in a crisis of lots of crises at the moment. And equally, when we're speaking to people in Whitehall, which is where the civil service is, and they're asking us about Brexit, I said, you've got to understand we're still in COVID panic and a lot of businesses are in survival mode. So yes, they know it's coming and it's coming very soon. The decision making apparently will be this week on Brexit. Yeah, again, it's another pivot point for Brexit. But you've got to understand they've got Brexit fatigue and they're in survival mode because they're having to shut or open or go online or, not knowing if they can get any furlough money and, lots of different issues that they're dealing with. So there's so many other crises happening that you have to understand that the timeline, and especially in a just-in-time business model, which the fashion industry works to, is very different. And knowing that insight, because I'm from it, I think helps to translate the needs, but also escalate the concerns, because it's very different being a trade body, which we're not, to being an organisation that is keen to accentuate and highlight issues. And also, I feel it's my duty to the sector.
What, leaning over to policy now, what policies or policy things that we're working on can help the sector in different areas? So Heather, this is kind of like your key, you're our key member that looks at all the things that are on the horizon coming up, things that are in motion now. Could you just explain kind of like, I guess, the journey of a policy item and how that gets passed and what that actually is? Like, what is a piece of policy? How does it get made?
Yeah, so from Fashion Roundtable, as Tamara's mentioned, we provide the secretariat for 2 all-party parliamentary groups. And I think we definitely do a really good job at utilising our parliamentary connections to kind of highlight our agenda and the fashion industry's agenda and the issues taking place within that. So I guess two of the main things that I'm working on at the moment, ethics and sustainability in fashion, which, link very closely with the title of the APPG. But what that really means is, and, I'm sure a lot of you already know about this, but when you look at things like what happened in Leicester this summer with modern slavery, labour exploitation, underpayment of the minimum wage, these things are really endemic within the industry, not just in places like Bangladesh, but also within the UK. So this is something that Fashion Roundtable are really keen to push back on, but not just that as well. The sustainability element of the fashion industry, as everyone will probably be aware by now, is absolutely shocking. I read a fact the other day that I think the fashion industry creates more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire economies of like France, Germany, and somewhere else. Like, it's just ridiculous. And also we need to kind of recognize how these two things are related. Climate change and exploitation are very much interlinked, and it's something me and Tamara talk about really frequently, because ultimately in this world where there's a race to the bottom in terms of trying to get the cheapest prices for garments, pushing workers to work on extortionate hours, trying to underpay workers because you need to be able to afford to keep prices low, also contributes to climate change, then also is a direct cause of exploitation. So essentially, that is what our policy paper with the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Ethics and Sustainability in Fashion is going to be exploring. And how do we get round to making our policy heard? Well, through our APGs, we do have these connections with parliamentarians, the change makers, some of the most powerful people in the country. We can pass these messages on, we can pass our ideas on, and hopefully they can help us push the agenda even further. But I don't think Tamara and I are unaware. We are very aware of the fact that policy takes time. It's not as if we are going to do this paper and things are going to be fixed like that. It's just not the case. This is why we, Fashion Roundtable is such a good job, because we keep on top of the issues and we keep pressing them constantly until we are heard. So, you look back at, some of our key policy achievements over the past 6 months or so is the UK made PPE, which is ultimately me and Tamara are looking at that and we're going, this is going to encourage greater onshoring in the future, which is so important. And then I saw an article in the Guardian a couple of days ago, which was like a report saying we can expect all this onshoring of UK manufacturing back to the UK, and this is what we're trying to get at. We're trying to keep the conversations going, so in the end we see the outcomes that we want. But I think, as Tamara said before, the industry isn't represented within politics as much as it needs to be. It just isn't. And so we try and give the industry that voice. And I think we're slowly getting there, definitely, because before the Fashion Roundtable was made, I think Game of Thrones was mentioned more in Parliament than the fashion industry was, which is obviously
seven times in 3 years.
Yeah.
No, sorry, 7 times. I think it was in 8 months. And the fashion industry wasn't mentioned at all.
It's criminal, isn't it?
And,
really?
and not only working with the cross-party parliamentarians that are part of what's called an APPG, but also with the ministers. And increasingly, we're able to escalate these concerns as we've become more established. So we've had chats with Victoria Atkins, who's working on the issues around slavery, and we have Heather does a weekly update to all our members. The parliamentary members, and also she does a monitoring report it's really difficult to say monitoring report every quarter, and literally the amount of what's called written and oral questions that our parliamentary members have submitted means that it becomes what's known as casework. And if you've worked in Parliament, you'll understand that casework is it's basically the system where you write into your MP and it becomes logged as casework. And the more that something becomes what's known as casework, the more that it will shift into being an agenda that any party will have a policy on. So it's a really important tool. So every change.org that you write in becomes known as casework for the caseworkers in that parliamentary office. And that means that, if you're certainly within Labour and the Conservatives, they will have to create a party policy that then will be widely adhered unless that particular MP wants to address it in a more individual way. So it does help on that level. And then it also helps it now as we're gaining more traction on the ministerial level. And I think that's really important. Also, we shifted the Environment Audit Committee had decided that we've done our fashion report. It's been rejected. All 18 recommendations have been said no to. Move on. and we really lobbied them. So one of their members is one of our APPG members, John McNally. He had a word. We emailed Nick. One of our supporters set up a campaign. Dillis wrote in from the Centre for Sustainable Fashion. We wrote in, and now they've done a report. They've done a review, which they're writing at the moment. So we sent in two submissions from both of our APPGs, and other people did. And the reason that's so important is that actually at a committee level, fashion doesn't really have much of a say, which is why it's so important for us to escalate, because I've had a look at all the current committees that are going on, and the fashion industry isn't a part of any of them. And why is that important is also when you look at, there's a particularly, it might sound a bit niche for a SHOWstudio audience, but it really isn't niche. The VAT retail export scheme is on the agenda now. And Heather, do you want to just explain what that is and why this is so important?
Yeah, so the VAT retail export scheme essentially gives tax returns and refunds to foreign visitors whenever they come to the UK and they buy, items from, from like a shop within an airport or, from the high street. They will get a return on their VAT. And the argument goes that, over the years, this has provided a lot of economic income into this country, including, through tourism and through people buying stuff when they come here, through hospitality. So it has really contributed a lot, and it's encouraged people from around the world it's encouraged people from all around the world to come to the UK and shop in the UK and spend their money here. And the government has now decided that it wants to withdraw the VAT retail export scheme. And there's no other way to say it, but the industry doesn't want it. And the industry, I think we should listen to the industry when they say that something isn't going to work. But the government believe that essentially they'll save money, but the industry is saying otherwise. And, in terms of what effect it's going to have, it's going to cost a lot of jobs within the retail sector. It's going to cost a lot of jobs within the hospitality sector. It's going to cost the UK a lot of money. And, the implications of withdrawing it are many. There are many of them. And so essentially some of the work that Fashion Roundtable have been doing is trying to essentially lobby government to bring back the VAT retail export scheme, which is meant to end in January 2021. And I think, what the government has to bear in mind, this is a really, really difficult time to be in the retail sector, like super difficult, like many stores are going under. Arcadia Group is probably going into administration today. And Arcadia Group are the ones that own, Topshop and them sort of high street shops. So by withdrawing this VAT retail export scheme, it's going to put a lot of businesses in a more precarious situation, in the middle of a pandemic where the retail sector is already struggling and has been struggling for a long time. So I guess the industry is very upset about it, and rightly so. And we're hoping to see a change soon, but whether we will or not, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
So thanks, Heather. So the mood music on it, for instance, is that the inside Whitehall, I've heard, they think there'll be a shift from one department. Another one saying, no, there won't be a shift, but they want a submission. So I sent in a submission end of last week. And basically my argument on this is that if it was me, I wouldn't just be closing it I wouldn't be closing it at all. I'd be opening it to EU residents for post.
Well, yeah, this is what needs
I'd be because at the moment, for the first year ever, this is not looking at this through the sustainability lens. Just to add this is looking at it from a purely business level. Charles de Gaulle Airport for the first time this year outstripped Heathrow. Obviously, this is a weird year with flights, but this as a destination is only going to grow. So my argument is, don't just think, this just affects Mayfair and Bicester, which is what they're saying. This is a whole gamut of people. Sorry. This is a whole raft. I can't even speak anymore. Sorry. Gamut of people. I was going to say raft, and then I put gamut with raft. You get rammet. Anyway, this is also the heritage brands who can't afford to open in the EU. This will affect your flagships. So that if you launch normally a business will launch into the UK to then move into the EU. If they're an international brand, they won't do that so much. They're more likely to have their flagship stores in Paris. You will get more flights and hospitality going into Paris. And maybe you'll get someone on a day trip, but they'll have done their numbers on their phone and worked out where it's cheaper for them to buy something, especially if they're buying from a brand such as a Gucci or a Louis Vuitton or something. They're going to do the price check and they're not going to buy it here. So that means that those flagship stores, which is going to affect the retail landscape, which is already on its knees. And then you've got the heritage brands that can't afford to open a flagship store, who are maybe, I don't know, a cashmere company in Scotland, or, you know, somebody that's doing even Beatles memorabilia in Liverpool, or a company in Brighton, which, you know, was on the news today as it's on its knees. But a lot of holiday people go, you know, it's a destination point for a lot of people. It's not just London, it's the whole of the UK. And it's completely counterintuitive. Business would say, encourage business. You want more of it, especially at a time when retail's on its knees and when people do price comparisons all the time. And it won't just affect the sector, it's also embedded with tourism and hospitality, which are also on their knees. So it's about arguing that with people who don't necessarily have different data, and you need to countermand that data with evidence.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight as well that this is not just a issue this isn't just recognised as an issue by, you know, Labour MPs, Green MPs, SNP MPs. This is an issue recognised by Conservative MPs as well. There is a large section of cross-party agreement that this is not a good decision, and that, you know, for the very least, we cannot withdraw the VAT retail export scheme until the retail, hospitality and tourism industries are doing better, which could be years from now. But, you know, you can't, I definitely feel like a lot of sympathy towards them. But this is a cross-party issue, and, you know, I think it's really powerful to have, you know, Conservative MPs signing early day motions, which is what an early day motion has just been tabled in the House of Commons by Tracy Crouch MP, I believe.
She was used to be the Minister for Sports, and she's a Tory. And also you've got Lord Vasey in the House of Lords, who's the Culture Minister.
When you have them voices within your own party, with a party that, you know, typically does not like to break the party line, saying that this is a bad decision, this is going to be catastrophic for the retail sector, this is going to be catastrophic for jobs, then I just don't know how the government can decide that this is the way they want to go and they're not going to listen, which is why I'm trying to be optimistic. I'm trying to stick with the optimists in this, which seems to be the people that you've spoken to, Tamara, who are saying, oh no, we think we'll see change, rather than some of the pessimists who are saying, no, it's definitely not going to happen.
I mean, a cost comparison of the jobs is the forecasts are that it is more jobs and more money than music, than film. The entire industry's just lost from that. I spoke to Vinnie Kendall from the British Beauty Council. She thinks it's 70% of business that they're selling out of Covent Garden and Selfridges. So the argument is that it's a London issue, but my argument is it's not just a London issue, that this is across the UK travel and tourism issue, because you want to entice that tourist. A, you want them to come. B, you want them to stay, not just on a day trip on Eurostar if they can deal with the queues. And C, you want them to buy. And you're not going to encourage that if you strip away something that, by the way, the EU's kept. How are you going to get their money? You're not going to get their money.
It goes to show, though, doesn't it, the kind of, you know, how little is understood about the fashion sector as a whole.
Or even business sector.
Yeah, and the business sector. I think it just goes to show how little is understood. Especially when, you know, as we mentioned before, like the government previously rejected all of the Environmental Audit Committee's recommendations for making fashion more sustainable and ethical. They have another review that's meant to be coming out, I think, in February of the fashion industry. Will they again reject all of these recommendations, despite the fact that only last week or the week before, time has lost all meaning to me, to be fair, so correct me if I'm wrong. But it was only a couple of weeks ago that the government has released its new Green Industrial Revolution 10-point plan. And in that, fashion or the textile sector it's just not mentioned once.
Not mentioned at all.
You know, extremely problematic given how damaging the sector can be for the environment,
and how much money it has, and how this is an opportunity for us to become the sustainable fashion leader. And that doesn't mean,
people we speak,
shepherds in Wales. This means business. This means exciting opportunities to be innovative and a global leader and part of the global market, because the market is switching, as we know from the data that we've had, that the growth in the sustainable consumer is only going one way, and to not want to lead on that and yet want to have onshoring, so there's lots of issues that we work on. The other one is visas. I mean, all these things are very, very technical, and they don't necessarily look like they're all aligned, but they really are aligned. So the visa issue for us is going to be a big issue post-Brexit, to get and attract workers, not only within the creative sector, where it's going to be marginally easier, is the good news. And, the news is that for people, that's if we get a deal with the EU, that the comings and goings of, say, the job I had will be easier, although there will be paperwork that we don't currently have. But to get garment workers in our factories who are already at capacity, you need to have a visa post-Brexit. And currently, you can't get them from the UK because we've not started the training in those skills until September 2023, which means they'll graduate July 2025, which is a lifetime in the fashion industry. And meanwhile, the garment workers come from Europe. So you need to be able to get them. And yet the government's decision on what the wage threshold is above what most garment workers earn. So we've been lobbying on that. It's called the SOL, the shortage occupation list, because it doesn't add up for us as a sector. So if you want work to increase in modern slavery issues, then carry on with that agenda. And we've gone back to them and said, have you done analysis on modern slavery impacts or COVID? And they haven't. So we've made the case. But sometimes you can feel a bit like a lone wolf, because it is quite interesting to me how little the sector had engaged. If you do a comparison, Jaguar did lobbying in 1 year that cost them 800 million. Jaguar Land Rover did this in 1 year. And I'm not saying that we need to spend 800 million, because obviously we're not all living in the White House and it's not all big lobbying firms from America, but our sector is worth more than a lot of other industries to the UK economy.
Yeah,
it is worth billions.
Yeah. And that's the fisheries is a crucial sticking point in the current Brexit negotiations, and it's worth a fraction of what the fashion industry is worth to the UK economy. Similarly, when Liz Truss, the International Trade Sec, was negotiating the deal with Japan, for some reason for Japan the sticking point was Stilton.
So we looked at the figures on how much do we make from Stilton. It's like what
I remember. It's like
I think it was £250,000.
Yeah, it's a small number, and in comparison, the fashion industry, as you can imagine, does a lot better. If
you look at the news in the mainstream media, a lot of people are like, "That's fantastic that the government are so concerned about our cheese industry," and you would read that and you would be like, "Yeah, great. I'm really glad that the government cares about our cheese industry. Of course I do." But when you start to drill in the numbers and you think, well, if that's going to affect our exports of heritage, but also our innovators in the fashion industry, because that's always been a great market for the UK fashion industry. And how does this deal compare with the EU's current deal with the EU? Well, it doesn't. So again and again, it's not just that you've got an axe to grind. It's that you drill into the data and you look at the information and you check the facts and you do a cross comparison, and then you can come up with some answers, and then you can lobby, because of course we want Stilton to be sold in the right way to the Japanese market, but we also want to ensure that they can buy our amazing brands and that we can buy their denim. I mean, it's a logical relationship that actually makes a lot more for the UK economy and the Japanese economy, by the way, than Stilton. And you can get caught by the headline noise, but the East London fashion industry alone makes more than the entire UK fishing industry. This issue on the VAT retail export scheme will lose more jobs than the entire, I think it's like 3 times. Pardon?
Yes, you describe like when it comes to the fishing industry, because the best way to describe it is, it's worth economic peanuts, but political dynamite, because it has such like an ingrained sort of narrative within our kind of like consciousness as like a nation.
But I want us to be that. I don't see why the fashion industry can't be that.
Start being that as well, because it's not worth economic peanuts, but it also is just politically not very recognized. And yeah, I think, from a lot of business perspective, also going back to like the ethics sustainability conversation, it's, from what we heard from businesses, it's really difficult because a lot of businesses will want to do the right thing, but because there isn't that regulation there, and because that isn't that sort of frameworks there to kind of guide the industry in terms of its, sustainability and ethics, it makes it really difficult. And I think a lot of businesses go, well, the playing field is so uneven. Why should I bother to be, ethical, sustainable, all these things, when, the pretty little things of the world are selling garments for, less than 10 pence, which, I think, it's hard to imagine how much they're paying their workers, plus what damage that sort of that is going to do to the environment. Because I was saying, me and you were speaking about at work with Tamara, but I said, if I buy something for 10p, do I care about that? Like, am I going to keep that? If it rips, if it needs to be mended, am I going to spend, a couple of quid taking it down to the tailors to get it fixed if I only bought it for 10p? Like, no, it's going to encourage a kind of throwaway culture, which I think is already there, to be honest.
So there's policy to the sector, and then there's policy reflected back to parliamentarians. I think it's a two-way stretch, because that actually is policy to the sector. I mean, that also cries out waste and over-ordering and lots of different issues, which are not necessarily the concerns of parliamentarians, but are the concerns of the sector on this culture, as we've seen with the COVID, of the crisis of non-payment to manufacturers, especially in Bangladesh, which is something we'll cover through this week.
What would you say, just to sort of like describe what we're going to be looking at this week in a sort of summary, going, what are we looking at over these next few days? So we've got various topics. So we've decided to do several topics rather than just one, and kind of do one each day. So what are we actually looking at across the days, and why are these important to us? And how can people engage with us across the few days?
Thank you. So I haven't got the list right in front of me, so I hope you have, Jodi.
I could list them off if you want to.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically we have front row to front bench, which again will be describing, the relationship between parliamentarians and fashion industry and the leaders within that space, having a literal discussion on certain points. Fashion is a global conversation, which is something that Fashion Roundtable has been championing for a very long time. It was actually one of the first ever, wasn't it, with Ashish that came about, really? So, it's a basic
podcast with him.
Yeah, so we kind of did that with him, and then.
But that's Brexit. More looking at we're using that tagline to look at sustainability through the two lenses of not only modern slavery but also climate change, and how you embed those conversations into actually having an exciting business rather than just being all doom and gloom, because obviously we don't want to provide a week of depression. But it's by raising these conversations that you can get to hope and change, I think. Yeah, sorry to interrupt that.
Yeah, no. You've got to have the sticky conversations to get through it, haven't you, basically? Yeah. And we're inviting loads of really exciting speakers across the globe on that, and different brands, and kind of people working within the UK as well, and globally, and kind of how that all intersects in a supply chain kind of way. Brexit and the fashion industry, one of our favourite topics, which is very timely, obviously, with that all happening at the end of December and January. And then the future of Made in the UK. So the reason why this is particularly important to us, as Heather highlighted, was around the PPE and why why we want to have onshoring in the UK. But as Tamara always says, onshoring done right. And what that means to us is to respect workers' rights, career development, and actually be an innovative and sustainable hub, global hub, and represented as such, globally.
Yeah, I think it's important that we want to champion British business. Can't get that out. It's a bit of a tongue twister. We really do want to champion British.
Try due diligence. That's the one I can't say.
But whilst also recognising that, the rights of workers, the future of our planet, and
with due diligence.
Due diligence is all very, also has to come at the forefront of every conversation we have around onshoring. That really needs to be the focal point. So yeah, I'm excited for the onshoring stuff. That's my source of interest. I'm like, yes.
Yeah. No, me too. Fashion and activism. So we've seen a rise in this a lot more with climate change and kind of different parties coming to vocalize fashion's place within climate change and activism, and people having more vocal voices on social media particularly. And then we're looking at creativity, so including creativity in education, because as Tamara alluded to earlier, the arts within a STEAM or STEM education still isn't in existence. And we tend to actually not focus on art very much at all, which art is not just about drawing and painting, it's around critical creative thinking. And if you can't instill that, then you can't go on necessarily to work in tech and all sorts of different places that need creative thinking.
And this draws on the work I did with Sharon, because Sharon is the chair, or now I think she's co-chair with Tracy Brabin of the APPG for art, craft and design and education. So I worked on that a lot. And the stats, because of the what's called STEM education agenda of this government through its several incarnations, but basically under the Tories, they have taken art and design out of the core curriculum. And you've seen a massive downturn in GCSE and A-level uptake. So it's what I call the Downton Abbey effect, in that the people who are going into the arts are going to be from the private school sector who follow a STEAM education agenda. And what you will see is increasingly STEAM, an elite point of view or an elite intake of people across not only the media, but also the fashion industry. And that's really problematic when you think about the other conversation we're having, which is representation and inclusion. So I think it's all very aligned. And although it can seem like we cover a lot of issues, they always come back to value and respect and understanding to embed culture change, because that's obviously what's needed. I think the sector knows from the conversations that we've hosted and other people have hosted over the last few months, in particular since the George Floyd murder, that change is necessary and it's a long time coming. And it reflects back on lots of different levels. If you don't respect the garment worker with the right kind of wages, with the right kind of business practice, then you're certainly not going to respect the creative. And obviously my background was the creative, but I too had issues of non-payment or very, very late payment and having to nag and then being blacklisted and worse, happening across a career that was largely lovely. But, the sector has a kind of glamour image, which is obviously one aspect of it, but there's so much more to it, which is what makes it fascinating. And I've loved my career in the industry. It isn't that I was so over it that I set up Fashion Roundtable. It's because I loved it that I felt it needed to have the same attention that other sectors have. I'm really looking forward to the representation and inclusion. We call it Are You Represented? Because that's our tagline for that Royce and Davina are going to work on. I think that's going to be really interesting to hear from different voices from the team as well. And also just to get real insights on what they think and where they're at with their research, because they've been working on our representation and inclusion paper. It'll be the first policy paper for the sector. It comes out early next year. We've had evidence sessions through our Textiles and Fashion APPG that's chaired by Lisa Cameron, who's an SNP MP, and we had a really strong engagement of cross-party peers and MPs with that, but also the evidence. Some of it was really upsetting to realise the structural issues that people are facing And the recommendations will both be policy for governmental policy recommendations, but also sector policy recommendations, because it's not for the government to make declarations which are already in law, such as the Equalities Act, in terms of accessible buildings or equal job opportunities. It's for the sector to clean up its act on those issues. But it is for policy recommendations in terms of different aspects that they're looking into for the government to address. And because there is a lack of committees looking at the sector, that's why we use our APPG so potently. We have a lot of meetings. We have meetings all the time. We are one of the most active secretariats for our APPGs because we realise their value. So while they're not just all the work that Fashion Roundtable do, they allow us the access, which gives us the scope to have these conversations, to then reflect back to the sector. So it is one aspect of our work, but for us, it's a very important way because there is a lack of other opportunities. So for instance, the BEIS committee, which is the business, and I think it's Business Energy Industrial Strategy, Whitehall department, we work with them a lot. But the committee had one day of a meeting about modern slavery. The EAC, which is the Environment Audit Committee, is looking at a number of different issues. It's a really active committee, such as installations, such as blah, blah, blah. COP26, which is coming up, which the UK will be leading at, is looking at climate change, but the green plan for the UK doesn't have fashion in it. So if we don't shout a bit, like, we'll just be overlooked. So that's the best way that we can muscle in to have our voice, because I certainly don't have 800 million to lobby in the way that other people from other sectors do. So we have to be collaborative and effective. And that's what we try to do with policy, is to collaborate where we see it's the right fit, such as RAP on waste. I signed up to one of their initiatives, or the BRC, the British Retail Consortium, on another, so that we can amplify messaging, but also so that we've got collaborators, because even all of the NGOs and all of the trade bodies and all of the fashion organisations, we don't have an 800 million budget. So, that's what you're up against. And how to make those voices effective is definitely by partnerships, which is why this is so fantastic for us to reach out to the SHOWstudio audience, because although obviously we have a lot of links, and Nick and Charlotte and Callum and the team have been fantastic to us over the 3 years that we've been around, their audience is an amplification of our own and a new audience, and that's really exciting for us to be able to explain things and to be there for conversations.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to the week ahead, because we've got lots in store.
Lots of prep. Thank you very much, Jodi.
If anyone has any questions, because I'm conscious of the fact that we haven't answered any in our chat box below, please just give us an email at admin at fashionroundtable.co.uk. Oh God, I can't get the words out today.
Admin at fashionroundtable.co.uk. Thank you. Thanks, Heather. I think that's a great idea. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.